Fellas, I remember a time when Khamzat Chimaev was getting hyped up to be the first triple champion in the UFC, the first guy to win a belt in 3 different weight classes. He was taking over every unranked prospect you can think of, and he genuinely looked like an unstoppable force in the UFC. And nowadays, I don't even think of Khamzat Chimaev. I feel like he doesn't even get talked about a lot. To go from one of the biggest prospects in the UFC to a guy that barely gets talked about nowadays, and he's only known for being a loudmouth on Twitter, I can't help but think Khamzat Chimaev has completely killed a lot of his own hype. And it's not even like he's gone on a losing streak or he's even lost a fight. The guy's undefeated, and he's still somehow managed to kill his own hype. And I'm going to be talking about why. I know it's not entirely his fault, which I will mention as well, but a lot of the reason his hype has died is definitely up to him. And I feel like the first main reason is his activity state. This guy, he's super inactive in the UFC. I remember a time when Chimaev was super active. Back in 2020, I'm pretty sure there was a time when he fought like twice within 10 days. He was super active. He was replacing people on short notice. He fought 3 times in 2020. And I feel like that's what you should do if you're a prospect in the UFC. If you want to be a big star, you want to be a big prospect in the UFC, you've got to fight regularly. You've got to win fights in dominant fashion, and they have to be regular. You can't be having 1 fight a year or 2 fights a year. I guess 2 fights a year is acceptable, but if you're unranked and you're not at the top level, you should be trying to fight as much as you possibly can. Chimaev was going out there barely taking any injury in any of his fights, and he was able to fight multiple times. Whereas nowadays, you look at Khamzat Chimaev, he fought once in 2021, he fought twice in 2022, but one of them was a weight miss. He was supposed to fight Nate Diaz, and then he had to quickly get replaced against Kevin Holland, so he's lucky that fight still got made. And then he fought an entire year later, over a year later, against, well, at UFC 294 against Kamaru Usman, in which he went full 3 rounds and looked very beatable in that fight. And now we're in March of 2024, and Chimaev's still not got a fight booked, and he's just been super inactive. And I feel like when you're an inactive fighter, people aren't going to be talking about you for long. If you were fighting on a regular basis, every couple of pay-per-views you were fighting multiple times a year, and I understand the higher ranked you get in the UFC, it kind of slows down because you've got less options. People get booked. There are matchups that make sense and matchups that don't. So the higher you climb the rankings, obviously it gets harder to fight. But Chimaev's like, what? He's ranked like near 10th. I think he's ranked 8th or something like that in the middleweight division. This guy's not even in the top 5 yet. So there's no excuse for him to be this inactive in the UFC. And I think if he was a lot more active, there'd be a lot more people talking about him and hyping him up. The next reason is that this guy barely beat Usman. After taking an entire year off, he comes back against a short notice Usman who was on a 2-fight losing streak, and he was in a completely different division, and he barely beat him. Most people think and agree that if that fight would have gone 2 rounds longer, if that would have been a 5-round fight, Chimaev would have been finished. He looked really good in the first round, I'll be honest with you. He was dominating Usman with his wrestling, and Usman's a great wrestler, one of the best. So Chimaev in that first round looked really unstoppable. And then the second and the third, his striking was sloppy. He couldn't get it going when it came to grappling. And most people, well, not most people, but a majority of the, well, a lot of people, let's put it that way, a lot of people thought that it should have ended in a draw or at least a win to Usman. So to barely beat Usman in a 3-rounder, it doesn't look good when people were hyping you up to be a first triple champion. You can't even beat Usman on short notice in a completely different division to what he's used to in a 3-rounder. So that's another reason. If he would have gone out there and dominated Usman and found that submission in the first round, there'd be a lot of hype. You've just finished one of the greatest welterweights of all time, a former champion in the middleweight division, I understand, but you've just finished a former champion in 1 round. That would have pushed him probably straight into the title picture. And he's just not done that anymore. And now, and the fact that he went from being the first triple champ to not being anywhere near a belt, the guy's nowhere near. He's still got at least, and this is if he's lucky, 1 more fight left before he gets a title shot. He's not even got a win over a single middleweight, a ranked middleweight right now. His last middleweight fight, like I said, was against Usman, who's a welterweight. He hasn't got a win over anyone in the top 10 in the middleweight division right now, and I think he desperately needs a win. And I don't even know if this guy beats the contenders to get to a title shot. I'm not even sure if I'd favour Chimaev to beat a guy like Dricus or a guy like Jared Cannonier, because if they can stuff his takedowns, and I don't think they'd have a big problem doing it, especially Dricus, on the feet, Khamzat Chimaev would be tossed. That guy's finished on the feet if he fights these guys. So I'm not sure he even beats the contenders. Even Strickland's a difficult fight at this point. And Adesanya, I think Adesanya's a kind of a 50-50 matchup, because I do think that Chimaev could finish Adesanya early on in the fight, but in the later rounds, like we said about the Usman fight, Chimaev's stamina is terrible. struggle. I think he'd genuinely struggle in the later rounds against a guy as experienced as Adesanya, and he could get picked apart. And my point is, he's nowhere near a title fight, and he's nowhere near the belt, and people are hyping him up to be the first triple champ, and now we don't even know if he's going to become a single champion in this UFC career, which is crazy. And even if he does fight for a belt, let's say the rest of his career is completely flawless, right? He wins, he gets good wins against, notable opponents. He's still probably not going to even fight for a belt until 2025. Like I said, we're in, March of 2024. He hasn't got a fight booked. Let's say he's booked in, like, June against Israel Adesanya, because I heard that's a fight that's been rumoured for, like, a card in, like, Saudi Arabia. Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev. And let's say he was to go out there and beat Israel Adesanya, which is a big if, because I still don't know if I favour him in that matchup. But if he was to go out there and beat Adesanya flawlessly, knowing Chimaev's inactivity, he's still probably not going to fight until at least 2025, and then he's got to actually beat the champion. So even if he was to have a flawless career and become the champion, we probably wouldn't see this guy fight until 2025, or at least late 2024 for a belt. So his inactivity is definitely showing there, and the fact that he's, like I said, so far from a belt, never mind triple champ status. And I think overall his style has completely changed. I remember knowing Khamzat Chimaev in early 2022 for being the guy that was ragdolling everyone. The amount of hype this guy had going into the Gilbert Burns fight, people were saying that this should have been the main event of the evening, the people's main event. And he was just known for ragdolling everyone, like he did to Li Jingliang, knocking out GM3. And I know he ragdolled Kevin Holland, but again, like I said, that was on short notice against a guy that wasn't preparing for you and you'd missed weight. So it's not like we're seeing those performances regularly. He went life and death against Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns was able to completely avoid any grappling offense from Chimaev. And on the feet, Chimaev looked like Dricus du Plessis the way he was going life and death. Again, a lot of people thought that Chimaev lost that fight. And then, like I said, the Usman fight, he looked good in the first round, but just wasn't able to get going after the first round. And the fact that if he would have gone out there and ragdolled Usman and Burns, fair play, this guy would still have a lot of hype. But he just doesn't. When people talk about Chimaev, they're not talking about him in the same way they were back in like 2022, 2021. He's kind of just known for being a loudmouth on Twitter. That's all he's known for. I've noticed that whenever a top-ranked fighter between the divisions of welterweight and light heavyweight get a win, the first thing you'll see on Twitter is Chimaev calling them out. Whether it's Alex Pereira, Leon Edwards, Sean Strickland, whenever anyone between the divisions of welterweight and light heavyweight get a win, Chimaev's the first person to call him out, which is ironic because he's also the last person out of all of these guys to actually fight. So that's another thing I've noticed. And then I know there's a few things that aren't under his control. He's got a terrible immune system, which I guess you can use as an excuse for his stamina, and that he's always getting sick and he's always getting ill. And I'm not going to sit here and say that he should be fighting when he's ill. So that's one thing I know he can't control. And I think there's a problem with him fighting in the USA. I've noticed that Chimaev only really gets booked around Saudi Arabian and Abu Dhabi cards. He never really fights in the USA anymore, which is a problem because like 80% of the cards nowadays seem to be in the USA. So if that's a problem for Chimaev, then that's a problem that maybe he can't get past. So if he's only restricted to Abu Dhabi cards, maybe that's why he's so inactive. But yeah, Khamzat Chimaev overall, I feel like he's killed a lot of his own hype. He went from being one of the most exciting prospects in the UFC to now being just another guy in the roster that used to be hyped and used to be he's not even the most hyped undefeated fighter. There's a lot more undefeated fighters in the UFC with a lot more hype and excitement than Chimaev. So that's my thoughts on his career. I still think he's got potential to win a belt, but it's just not looking good in this current stage of his career, especially compared to the hype that this guy was getting a few years ago. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on Chimaev. Do you think he's going to win a belt? And thank you for watching.